Hello, everyone, and welcome from the University of Georgia Office of Research. Today is Tuesday, March 9th, 2021. Thank you for joining us for this session of Research Matters Live on training grants, preparing for success. My name is Mike Terrazas, and I'm the Director of Research Communications here at UGA. We look forward to providing you some useful information today and answering your questions as best we can. Before we get started, just a couple quick housekeeping points. We'll wait until the end of the presentation to answer questions, but you can ask your question pretty much any way you like. You can ask it through the chat, through the Q&A, or through the raise hand function, and you should see all those along the bottom of your Zoom window. If you raise your hand, we'll assume you want to ask your question by voice, and we'll enable your microphone while you ask your question. We'd like to hear any feedback, love to hear any feedback you have about today's session, including suggestions for future topics. The Research Matters Live page on the Office of Research website has a suggestion form that you can access through a big red button at the top of the page, and we encourage you to make use of it. I will put the URL for that website in your chat window here in just a second. And with that, let's go ahead and get started. Let me introduce our speakers today. We've got Jake Maas, Director of the Office for Proposal Enhancement, the Office of Research, and Meredith Welch-Devine, Interim Assistant Dean and Director of Interdisciplinary Graduate Programs in the Graduate School. Jake and Meredith, it's all yours.
Thanks, Mike, and thanks everyone for coming. I think that we have a really good, unexpectedly big turnout. So we're very glad to hear that so many people are interested in training grants. And of course, I need to emphasize that this is going to be not a 30,000 foot view, but maybe a 12,000 foot view of the process, and that it's going to focus primarily on the pre-award stage. So we're not going to talk about managing training grants in this session, but we do have some resources for you if you're interested in that at the end. And we're going to focus on NSF NRTs and NIH T32s. And I realize that other federal agencies have their own training grant programs, and also want to emphasize that I'm here to help with any training grant that you want to apply for, and you can certainly reach out to me individually with any questions that you have and to get started on that process. So I wanted to frame this by talking about the go, no go decision, which is kind of a businessy term, but one that we like to apply to the grant proposal process. So obviously you don't want to waste a huge amount of time developing a proposal and then realizing that it's not going to be competitive the night before you submit, because that is very depressing. So we in proposal enhancement like to emphasize that you should be thinking in terms of, are we ready to go ahead or are we not? And then if you're not, thinking about what it would take, whether you really want to do this, and then what it would take to be competitive. And for smaller proposals, that might be a shorter timeline. But for a training grant, which has a great deal of work involved in it, you might need a couple years even to develop a program to the point where it can be competitive against, the Stanfords and the Harvards and the MITs of the world. So if you're not ready to apply, and so if we go through this, sort of be thinking both in terms of these two timelines. So one timeline is, we're not ready to go. What do we need to do to get there? It's going to take a while. We need to put a plan in place to get things to where they need to be. If you are ready to apply, it's still a pretty long timeline because training grants are labor intensive. And if you are, get in touch with me. I help with almost all of the training grants that UGA submits at this point. And think about a timeline of 6 to 8 months. And we're starting to put some plans into place to really emphasize that. And we also have some incentives in terms of support that we can offer. And turning it over to Meredith.
So one of the first questions to consider, of course, is should you do this? Why should you do this? What is the benefit of doing this to you, to your department, to your students, to the discipline? And the kind of most obvious answer is that it will pay a good chunk of student stipends for you. So we'll get into details later about what exactly can be covered with these training grants, but they do allow you to increase your graduate programs. And so that's, of course, a key draw. But I don't want you to overlook kind of the more intangible things that can also be really beneficial to come out of a training grant. It really gives you an opportunity to think critically about your curriculum, for one thing. And that's something that we often don't do quite enough. And sometimes the curriculum can get a little stagnant. And this just gives you kind of an opportunity and a leverage point to really make sure that your program is up to national standards or at the very cutting edge, preferably. So that's a great thing. It also can really catalyze and incentivize faculty collaboration, particularly across disciplines. You'll note as we go along that many of these training grants are centered around themes of interdisciplinary research. So this can give you an opportunity and some impetus to really reach out to your colleagues and to work on collaborations that you might not have had otherwise. And finally, it brings a level of prestige to your program that will allow you to recruit better students and potentially recruit more diverse students. It's also a big priority for the university. We are consistently falling behind our peers in terms of the number of training grants that we have, and that's something we would really like to see change. And so Jake's office, as he will explain, has a lot to offer you. Our office does as well, and we're really committed to supporting these things. So let us know when you're interested. All right, Jake, maybe that's a good point to talk about support.
Okay, so what does the proposal development process look like, and what are the elements that you need to have in place? So obviously you need a PI or director who's going to bear the brunt of the work and do at least coordinate all of the writing. And that person, depending on the training grant program, obviously the strongest PIs have a significant background of good funding history, a good history of mentoring, and a good history of collaboration. So those are kind of the what these agencies will be looking for in terms of a director. You also need, unless you're going to write the whole thing yourself, you really need a core writing team. And hopefully what I've seen is the teams that are most successful, at least in terms of the proposal process, are those that have, at least 3 or 4 other faculty members who are interested enough and motivated enough to stay engaged in the writing process as you develop the proposal. So, toward the beginning, you might assign them sections to outline, and toward the end, you might be firing off assignments and need people to write stuff pretty quickly in order to meet it. Hopefully not, but in practice, that's sometimes what happens. So you need a good team. Administrative support for data gathering. So these are incredibly data intensive proposals. NIH a little more than NSF, but regardless, you're going to have to gather a lot of institutional data. If you're just looking at one department, it's a little easier, but you're still going to need somebody at the unit level, an administrative support staff person usually, who has access to the historical data for your department. When you get multiple departments involved, then you need you still have someone coordinating, but you'll need multiple people who have access to accurate information about things like student placement history and publication histories and that kind of stuff. And some of that can come from the faculty members who will be mentors, but ideally it should be come from multiple sources so you can make sure that the data is accurate. So you'll need somebody ideally at the unit level. Proposal enhancement, and that's usually me, can help in various ways in terms of data gathering. For NIH, I usually do tables 3 and 4. Table 4 is the funding history, which is a lot of rote data gathering, but that ends up being sort of my role in the data part of it. The graduate school, Karen Young, is also available to act as kind of the glue that holds all of this together. And she can do a lot of the the work of communicating back and forth with faculty and getting all of their components in order. So excitingly, we now have, through the Office of Integrative, it's not an office, Integrative Team Initiatives within the Office of Research, which is Larry Hornack's shop, we have the option of doing red team reviews. So that is where we gather an external panel of experts, and often they're people who have review experience serving on study sections or review panels. Sometimes they have experience, we look for people who have experience managing one of these, and we actually pay them. So it's sort of while supplies last, because we don't have infinite funding for this, to serve as independent reviewers of the proposal. And there are a lot of benefits to that. So one is that it kind of forces you to have what we call a 75 to 80% draft done well in advance of the deadline, because no one wants to embarrass themselves in front of the red team. It can be galvanizing for the core writing team and other faculty who are working on that, because you can then, we're paying for this service, and it's exciting to be able to get feedback prior to the actual submission and review by the funding agency. And in fact, it kind of serves as a actual submission, because you get feedback, you meet with the red team over Zoom, and you can ask them questions, which is something you can't do of the study section. And basically you can get a review before you get the review from the funding agency. So you're one step ahead. So that is something that we're offering, and that's really makes sure that the proposal is in competitive shape by the time it gets submitted. Other forms of institutional support. So this is the money question, partly. So both the NSF NRTs and the NIH T32s expect there to be institutional support, both in-kind support, which is described in a lot of places in the proposal, but then also matching support, and a plan for sustainability, especially for the NRTs beyond the end of the project period. And we'll talk more about that later. So I have the honor of coordinating institutional support requests for training grant proposals. So I am happy to work with you on the budget and talk about what's realistic and what we can ask for. I have a little flow chart here of how that works. So we want to see some contribution from each of these elements. So your particular unit, or your college, then the grad school can commit resources, the Office of Research can commit resources, and I have provost in there because that's usually who ends up signing the letter of institutional commitment for the program. And in fact, the NIH T32s now have a 10-page letter that has to be signed by the provost. So this is another thing to get started thinking about fairly early in the process, because you have to get a lot of approvals along the way. So the types of potential institutional support, and this is not a all-you-can-eat buffet. This is a mix and match a la carte menu. So one thing that we see in most proposals is an additional trainee slot, either from the grad school or Office of Research or both, to help build the program even further. As we'll talk about later, NIH does not cover all of the student stipend costs, so that money has to come from somewhere. The research, help me out, the research assistant incentive for training grants program, which you also may know as the VIP program, is a pretty great thing to use here, because you get to include tuition, you have to include tuition in the budget, and that can give you extra assistantships along the way. Sometimes we see people asking for funding for a part-time administrator if there isn't somebody available to fill that role. So that's something the Office of Research sometimes provides. And also funding for student activities that may not be covered by the grant, such as funding for invited speakers, funding for retreats, and additional funding for things like research costs and conference travel. And I put a big note in all caps, so work with me on the institutional support requests because it will make everyone much happier. Back to Meredith.
And the first thing I'm going to do is just go ahead and reiterate what Jake last said and say that this has really, really got to start early. He showed how many folks this has to move through. It takes a lot longer than you might think and that we might hope. So please start early. So if we think about what makes a training grant competitive, it boils down to a few key things. One is having a compelling theme. Another is that you can actually do what you're going to propose, that you are the best person, the best team to do it, and that it's going to actually have an impact, that there will be students who will come. And for the NRT, also that it is something that could be picked up. It's a model that could be replicated at other places. So there are a lot of different things that reviewers are going to be looking for to make those determinations. So they want to see, for one, that you have a potential trainee pool that is large enough and diverse enough to bring in and to stand up the program. So particularly for NIH, they're going to want to see in those data tables that your program has been doing a good job of attracting and retaining diverse populations. So it's not going to work to go in and say, we're going to have a cohort that's going to be 50% underrepresented minorities. If they look through your data tables and see that you have graduated one Black student in 10 years, one Hispanic student in 10 years, it has to be a credible claim that you can deliver on. So it's very important that those things kind of match up. Also, beyond the students, they're going to look at the mentors. Do the mentors have experience training students already? Do they have grant support already? So NRT, for example, doesn't fund research, even though it has to be built around a research theme. So they expect the trainers to have a strong pool of research funding already to enable that student training. And then the NRT comes in and funds the students on top of that. So that's very important. You also want to show that these mentors have worked together before. So that may be collaborative grants, it may be having published together, or any other way that you can show that this team already has some history together and has a strong likelihood of success working together. Also, you want to be able to show why UGA and why this team. So that's when we talk about differentiators. Jake, can we see the pretty photo that you gave us? Oh, I was thinking of the wrong slide, sorry. Yeah, we already went through this, so I think you can go to the next one. Yep. So professional development, let's do pause there and talk about that. This is something that is becoming increasingly important. And in addition to professional development, I would also say career preparation. So this is everything from teaching your students communication, giving them skills on job seeking, anything that's going to help them kind of outside the lab and outside the research setting to become a successful student and have a successful career. So they both NIH and NSF will want to see strong plans in these areas. This is one area too where the graduate school can help. So we are happy to sit down with you and think about the curriculum that you're developing, and also to think about any professional development and career development that you would want to implement. So we do have some existing programs that you could draw on and leverage, both through the experiential professional development and through our professional development that's more oriented towards students who will stay in academia. So reach out early and we can connect you with the right folks to make sure that you've got what you need for your proposal. Now the differentiator slide that I was looking for. So you want to be able to say why UGA, right? And for the NRT in particular, it's a delicate balance because you also want to be able to show that your program can be picked up and replicated elsewhere. So you have to convince them that you're unique enough, but not too unique that nobody else could ever replicate this. So some things you might think about as you're seeking to differentiate your program are what do you have in terms of field sites potentially or instrumentation? What kinds of partnerships can you leverage? What sorts of community partners do you have or industry partners? And this is one of those things where if you say, here we are at the University of Georgia, and we're going to have all our students in the field doing work in Seattle, it's going to potentially give them a little pause. They want to see things that make sense, that are connected potentially in your region, or if it's overseas, that it's with existing partners. They really just need it to be credible. And then finally, think about any existing certificate or degree programs that you could tap into. So we have several interdisciplinary certificates and interdisciplinary degree programs. And if you can think about ways to connect and leverage with those, that can also make your proposal stand out. It also, particularly for the NRT, can be an opportunity to propose something new. So sometimes it can be helpful to show that students who go through the NRT will actually come out with a credential that is different than they would have gotten somewhere else or would have gotten at UGA in the absence of the NRT. Okay, Jake.
All right, so on to some logistics. We're up to like 20,000 feet here. So there's obviously a lot to delve into in terms of specifics about each of these programs. But here's sort of what's helpful to know at this point. So NSF, National Research Traineeships, they issue 14 to 16 awards per year. And I don't know what the number of applications is, but it is in the low hundreds, I would imagine. So it's a very competitive program. It's a 5-year project period and it is not renewable. So that is something to consider when you're thinking about how this will help to build a program. It is up to $3 million for the whole thing. It's a limited submission, which means there are only 2 applications allowed to go forward per institution for each deadline. However, it used to be one deadline in February, and they've added another one in September. So there are 2 deadlines, February 25th and September 6th, and for each of those, 2 can go forward. So there is a limited submissions competition, so be watching out for that. And we did sort of time this so that it would come out right after we issued the limited submission competition for the September 6th deadline. And if you're thinking that's a really long way off, that's true in one sense, but this is the time to start working and thinking about what a proposal might look like. Again, not necessarily with the view that we're going to do this no matter what, but in an exploratory way to see if you have all the resources and capacity that you need to be able to be competitive. That's about a 6-month timeline that we're looking at. So the key elements, this is a very simple but also complicated slide. So these are straight out of the horse's mouth for the NRT. So they are particularly focused on interdisciplinary and convergent research and training. And so if you haven't looked at NSF's definition of convergence, it is well worth taking a look at. It goes beyond interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary research to research that comes up with a whole new paradigms for looking at a specific problem or set of problems. So that's something that can be a differentiator if you're able to show, especially as we were talking about earlier, if you have a strong history of collaboration and especially collaboration with other disciplines. They're looking for inclusive workforce development. So a couple of things there. It's obviously very focused on diversity and diversifying the STEM workforce. And also the idea of workforce development. I didn't include this, but there's a nice chart that shows how many students who graduate from move from graduate school not into academia but into the workforce and private industry. So that's something that NSF is interested in promoting as well. And then institutional transformation, and that is a high bar. So that is the long-term outcome that they're looking for. And it's helpful when you're developing your proposal to keep that to keep that goal, that distant goal in mind, and try to aim as much of your activities and as much of your outputs and your short-term outcomes toward that goal as possible. And it also requires a lot of buy-in from levels of administration. So that's something, there's a certain element of lobbying to this as well. NIH is the full title, the NIH Ruth L. Kirstein National Research Service Award. The logistics are, this is a 5-year project period as well, but these are renewable every 5 years. We have a genetics training grant here that we have had for, I believe, 42 years, I think since 1978. It's obviously a very good program, or they wouldn't keep renewing it. It is both for pre and postdocs. The only one we have right now that involves postdocs is the one in the Center for Tropical and Emerging Global Diseases. But that is an option if you want to support postdocs. There is no total budget limit, but they only pay 60% of the stipends up to $16,000, and they cap the other costs, various other costs. So while you could conceivably have, if you had the population, you could have 10 or 12 or 15 trainees, you're going to have to come up with a way of paying the rest of their stipends. So typically we see that there are 6 or 8. Those are the most common numbers of trainees, sometimes a little fewer, sometimes a little more. This is not a limited submission, but we still would like you to get in touch with us because of the resources that we can provide. And also, well in advance of the deadline. And the deadline, so the situation is a little complicated with NIH because every institute or center has their own FOA. And while there are 3 deadlines established for T32 proposals, January 25th, May 25th, September 25th, most of them will only let you apply to 1 or 2 of those. So you have to sort of research what institute you're applying to, when the deadlines are, and then get in touch with us, hopefully 6 to 8 months out. The FOAs also vary because different institutes are looking for different sorts of outcomes in terms of trainees. So it's important to look at those carefully. And there are other little sort of minor details that are important to be aware of as you delve into the process. Key elements of NIH T32. So again, this is kind of the boilerplate language that they have, but I think it's pretty descriptive. So they should provide a strong foundation in research design methods and analytic techniques to enhance trainees' ability to conceptualize and pursue a research project with increasing independence. They are meant to enhance their understanding of the health-related sciences and the relationship of their training to health and disease. So this is obviously going to be a little less broadly applicable to every department in the sciences in UGA, there's a great deal of importance. So in terms of the reviews that I've seen and ones that we've submitted, there's a lot of importance placed on the information that goes into the data tables, which occupy a chunk of about 80 to 150 pages of the proposal. That's how much data they ask for. And those things they closely compare us institutionally with the other submitters. And they really do value and take a close look at the track record, things like track record of mentor funding. That's the glorious table 4. Training experience. So how many students have people trained and how long have they been doing it? Student publications, that you have to go back, I think 10 years in terms of publication history of your students. And they figure out how many are first author publications and compare that level of detail to other submitting institutions. And student placement in the workforce or in academia. So having faculty who have stayed in touch with their students becomes weirdly important here. And so those are all things to sort of consider when you're thinking about whether you're ready to go after one of these things. Do we have access to all of that data? What are our records in these areas? And if it looks like we wouldn't be competitive, then do you want to invest the resources to specifically improve in those areas to the point where you are competitive? So that is kind of the nuts and bolts, both in terms of what the process is and what kind of support is available for the proposal development. I didn't ask any of these people if you could contact them, but I'm sure they'd be happy to talk to you. If you want to hear, get the whole scoop on what it's like to apply for and get and manage a training grant. So the IDEAS NRT, that's the one NRT that we have, and it is wrapping up or possibly wrapped up, and that's Vanessa Zenwa in ecology. We have 3 current T32s. The one in the Center for Tropical and Emerging Global Diseases was just renewed. Glycoscience, I think, runs for another year, but we are working on the renewal right now. And the genetics T32 just reapplied in the fall. So these are the people to reach out to if you are seriously considering this and need someone to talk to who's been through the fire. Okay, that's what we have for you. And again, I'm very happy to talk to people one-on-one about anything that any help in any way that I can. So feel free to reach out to me. Our email addresses are here. And now I think we're ready to take questions.
Great. Jake and Meredith. No questions at the moment. Folks are being a little shy today, so just chime in with your questions whenever you want through the chat or the Q&A, or raise your hand. Oh, I got one, sorry. John McCracken has a question and he wants to ask by voice. John, your microphone should be on.
Hi, thanks for the presentation. I was interested if you could comment briefly about collaborative training grants between universities, whether that is a common strategy, sort of what sort of approaches are used to sort of have a collaboration between faculty at a different institution. Thanks.
Meredith, do you have a good answer to that?
Well, I don't know if it's a good answer, but I can start with some answer. So one of the first things that I would signal is if you're looking at an NRT, it's really important to kind of keep the limited submission rules in mind, because even if we're collaborating as a sort of secondary partner when another institution is the lead institution, that counts against UGA's limited submission quota. So still very important to be in touch with Jake and Jake's office and to make sure that you're in communication that whole time. As far as collaboration, I would kind of go back to some of the things that I said before about credibility. So if you're coming together for the very first time around one of these training grants, it's going to be hard for reviewers to believe that you're going to be successful. So you really want to show a track record. Another thing that I would say is, particularly if you're partnering with a smaller institution, it's going to be important to pay a lot of attention to the relative roles of those institutions. So they're really not going to want to see a smaller, maybe regional school or even technical school simply acting as a feeder to UGA. It's important that the students at that university are going to get something out of this, that the faculty at that university are going to get something out of this as well, and that the partnership is a much more sort of equal partnership. Does that help?
Great. Thanks, Meredith.
Thank you.
Got another question here. Please define RAIT/VIP, the mechanism of institutional support.
So that's just one mechanism of institutional support, but the research incentive assistantship, as it's called, basically what happens is when you put tuition on your training grant, for every student that you put on, you end up getting a return back. And there's sort of a little bit of a formula. And the idea is that you can use that money to bring another student on. So we're in the process of looking at this a little bit. Right now, the way it works, you can do this with a research grant, and it doesn't matter kind of how many students you put on your research grant, you will always get that return. But it's been limited with training grants, and that is something that we're taking a look at, because as I mentioned before, increasing the number of training grants really is a priority for us, and we want to see how we can better incentivize that. But if you have more questions about exactly how that works, we can kind of point you to the website and point you to the business office.
Thanks again, Meredith. Got another question in here. Does your office also aid with different types of training grants, perhaps those with a more clinical focus, such as the predoctoral interdisciplinary research training program in the education sciences or the NIH R25, mentoring networks for mental health research education?
The answer is yes. Just get in touch with me. We're interested in, so the primary purpose of my office is to get more large, complex projects funded at UGA and to make us more competitive for those. But part of that is also building up our institutional capacity across campus. So we are very interested in anything like training grants, facilities grants, equipment grants, that kind of stuff. So yes, absolutely.
And us too, we're happy to help with any kind of training grant. And in fact, Karen just, I guess it was in the fall or maybe even the summer at this point, was working on an R25 with some faculty.
Thanks again to both of you. Okay, what is the average year's experience / rank of PIs on training grants?
Ooh, that's a good question. Jake, I'm gonna toss it to you for NIH. I think you might have a better sense, but from having sat on review panels for the NRT, I will say that NRT likes to see a mix. So they want to definitely see full professors who have a long trajectory of research and mentoring, but they do want to see younger folks coming in as well, more junior folks. So having a blend within, so there's a PI and some co-PIs, and then there's some senior participants. And in that list of 10, they definitely want to see junior faculty as well. And it's important also that that there be diversity, not just in career stage, but other types of diversity as well, whether it's race, ethnicity, gender. It's important to have a pool of a leadership team that's going to be kind of reflective of the student body you want to draw.
Yeah, I would just add, so if the question is about sort of the faculty as a whole, yeah, I totally agree. In terms of the PI or director, those are usually more senior faculty who have a wealth of experience and also a certain amount of clout to clearly be able to manage a program that it might involve as many as 40 faculty, possibly from across campus. So, but I think that both NIH and NSF are really interested in seeing a variety of career stages in terms of the mentors especially. And mentoring experience is a key consideration as well for NIH. They are specifically look at, for example, the section A of your personal statement. They want you to talk specifically and in detail about your mentoring so that you can show that you'll have the ability to mentor students.
And if I can add one more thing about NRT too, the NRT actually goes through 2 rounds of review. So the first is a scientific and technical review. So you have to be able to show that the team has the research chops to get this thing done. And then the second review is focused almost entirely on the curriculum and pedagogy and mentoring. And there again, it has to be credible that your team can do what it takes to get your students through and get them into satisfying careers.
Great, thanks to both of you. Any more questions before we let Meredith and Jake go today? Give it just a couple more seconds here. Okay, well, thanks again to everyone, all of you, for joining us today. We hope you found the session informative and engaging. If you need to refer back to it, the video recording and the slides from today's presentation will be posted on the Research Matters Live website within the next few days. Please do make use of that suggestion form on the site if you'd like to provide any feedback. And we encourage you to spread the word about Research Matters Live to your colleagues and friends if you found today's event helpful. We've got a healthy schedule of upcoming events if you want to check out our website. And we continue to add more as the semester goes on. So thanks again to Meredith and Jake for their time today. And on behalf of the Office of Research, thanks to all of you. Have a great rest of your week. Bye-bye.